to cut you here. And then Richard Silverstein, if you all want to get some more of this conversation, stay right here on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. God bless you, everybody. Richard Silverstein, now we're going to continue.
Okay. So
Netanyahu?
yes, what I was going to say is that the United States put forward a new proposal for a ceasefire. It announced that it was very hopeful, very positive spin on things, and Hamas had basically agreed to this new proposal. It had modified its demands so that the new proposal would be seen more favorably by Israel. And Biden said that Israel was on board, and that the only thing that was necessary was finalizing the deal, which was going to start the process this week. And yesterday, Netanyahu announced his new stance towards the ceasefire proposal. And the statement that he made, the headline was, this is from Netanyahu speaking, my response to the attempt to stop our troops from dealing with what is going on in Rafah. Not my new stance towards a ceasefire, but framing the attempt at a ceasefire as halting the ability of the IDF to do its job, in Gaza. And of course, this indicates that the chance of a ceasefire is hopeless. The attempt by the U.S. to broker a ceasefire is hopeless. And this is, again, another part of the absolute failure, the absolute weakness, the absolute sort of futility of the Biden administration approach to Gaza. The unwillingness to hold Israel accountable, the unwillingness to withhold arms shipments and U.S. military aid to Israel. It allows Israel to go forward with whatever it wants to do. And what is new about what Israel is doing is that it always is attempting to move the line in the international rules-based order farther and farther away and towards whatever its interests are. And there hasn't been a genocide like this. Well, I suppose there has been one in Myanmar, but there hasn't been a genocide like this in quite some time, and there hasn't been one in Israel's sort of approach to the region, and because there is such a weak U.S. president, it's now able to commit genocide. It could expel all people in Gaza. There are many people in the Israeli government, Knesset, who want to expel all of the Gazans, who want to take over Gaza and turn it into a Jewish settlement, coastal beach paradise kind of thing. And because of Biden's weakness, and I don't know if that's part of his ongoing senility and dementia that's happening to him, but he's definitely not on top of what's going on. And if he is compos mentis and allowing this to happen, that's even more of an indication of his utter failure as a president. And the other thing I wanted to add was that in a couple of weeks, Netanyahu is supposed to come and address Congress.
Yeah.
A joint session of Congress. He's supposed to have this great honor that's accorded to relatively few foreign leaders. It would be his second joint address to Congress. He addressed Congress once to try to stop us from negotiating an Iran nuclear deal, which we did anyway under President Obama. And now the Democrats, the leaders of the House and Senate, the Republicans and Democrat leadership, have given this sort of golden opportunity to Netanyahu to spread his message of hate and genocide in the United States, and nobody's doing anything to stop him. Thankfully, at least 100 Democrats in Congress have announced they're not going to attend the session. But I think personally that this invitation should be rescinded right now. We've got a president who may be entering dementia. We've got a presidential race that's in turmoil now because of that. This is not a time to have Bibi Netanyahu come to the Congress and shout his praises and the praises of the idea before the American people. And I'm hoping that because of the uncertainty and instability in the US political process, that they'll realize that they've got to stop this invitation, because it's an insult to our moral reputation to have. I mean, can you imagine inviting Milosevic to address U.S. Congress, or inviting Hitler to address the U.S. Congress in the midst of genocide, or
No, or
inviting
Botha from South Africa. I mean,
yeah,
I think about
exactly.
that.
Exactly, inviting him to address Congress, and it's just unspeakable that that we are taking the stance that we are as the American people, and I hope that we wake up and come to our senses. And I admire you for having a more hopeful outlook. I wanted to also add to your very moving discussion of your father and how he sort of passed his legacy on to you. And I have 3 children, and I'm trying to raise them as aware citizens. And my oldest son is quite active as an anti-Zionist in the younger sort of generation youth movement. And even though I know that there will not be peace in my lifetime in the Middle East, there will not be a single state in Israel, Palestine, or even 2 states, unfortunately, in my lifetime. I'm hoping that if they keep working towards that goal, that eventually the world will come to its senses and something will happen. I'm hoping that the international community realizes the only way to change what Israel is doing is by some sort of intervention by the outside world. Israel politically will never come to its senses, will never elect a leader who is willing to accept a just solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. I've given up any hope of that, and that's why I've become an anti-Zionist. At one time earlier in my life, I was what I would call a liberal Zionist, but that's a hopeless stance to take in the face of genocide, in the face of apartheid. So I'm trying to be more hopeful
Well,
than.
Mr. Silverstein, I tell you, I'm hopeful because 40 years ago, we couldn't have this conversation openly. And I know my father was always painted, since he and my mother went to the Middle East in 1979, as strident anti-Semites. And their point was then, and has always been, Israeli security and Palestinian justice are married to each other. And what we're trying to offer you is a solution that will save you. Because if you keep on going in this direction, you're going to, hurt yourselves. Because you're moving into arrogance. Arrogance always leads to hubris, and hubris always destroys. And that's where we are now. And it's, you know what? It's not, this is part of the human condition. And I want to bring Attorney Robert Patillo in, because he, of course, has been, you can hear him doing international commentary all over the world on this particular issue. And I'm so glad that you stayed. And I hope that you'll be on his show on WAOK from 1 to 4 every Sunday, one of the most listened to shows in the Southeastern regional United States. It's an incredible show. And he's absolutely brilliant. Robert, why don't you respond to what you've heard from Mr. Silverstein? And if you want to ask him a question, please feel free.
Oh, well, I agree with everything you pointed out, and I've made the point to people that Netanyahu does not want to go back to the 67 lines or the 47 lines. He wants to go back to the 2000 BC lines. He wants the historical borders of Israel and Judah, and that he has shown no inclination towards a two-state solution and towards settlement. My question is for the voters in Israel. It seems that they've tried every method and methodology to try to remove Netanyahu from power, but he still returns every few years. Whether he's indicted, whether he's pushed out of office, he always comes back. Is the right-wing Zionist forces in Israel that powerful that it can subvert the will of the people? And what do the people of Israel have to do to kind of cleanse that from the government so that they can have an opportunity for actual negotiations and two-state solution?
Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about Israeli domestic politics, since you've given us an introduction to that with your question. The Israeli government, the coalition, the current coalition that rules Israel, is composed of not just far-right forces, but they're composed of Judeo-fascist, Judeo-Nazi parties. And they're led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, the police minister. They're led by Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister and deputy defense minister. And they are the types of people who want to eradicate Palestinians, either by violence or by forcing them to leave the West Bank so that they can build settlements there and take over the land in the West Bank. And also their solution in Gaza is just to eradicate the Palestinians. Now, that figure of 186,000 I mentioned earlier from the Lancet article, that's 7% of all of the people in Gaza. Of the 2.5 million people, 186,000 is 7%. If you do the math and you compare 2.5 million to 335 million in this country, you can see how enormous that figure would be if it was Americans being killed. Mm-hmm. So going back to Israel, because the far right controls the government, the only constituency that Netanyahu needs to address and satisfy is the far right, is Smotrich, is Ben-Gvir. He can ignore everybody else in the country. He doesn't have to go to elections for another year or two. And he runs on a security platform that he'll keep Israel safe, which of course he isn't doing, because we now have 700 IDF soldiers killed, and we have half the hostages in Gaza are dead, probably by the IDF hostilities inside Gaza killing them, or most of them. So the people can shout and scream and demonstrate, and they have. Hundreds of thousands of them have demonstrated. They want Bibi gone. All the polls say that they don't trust him and they wouldn't vote for him if they could. It doesn't matter, because and the reason why, going back to what I said about his new response to the ceasefire deal, which basically destroys the chance for a ceasefire, is that he has to satisfy Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And that's why he's put forward these demands of the ceasefire deal that are absolutely impossible. That even the mediators won't bother to take this proposal to the Hamas and ask them to respond to it, because it's hopeless. He basically is asking, he's saying that he's demanding that the war continue after ceasefire would be over, that all the hostages, that the IDF would continue to hunt for the hostages and try to free them, and that Egypt has to agree to stop any smuggling of arms from its territory into Israel. And Egypt bristles at that, because it's basically Israel claiming that Egypt is deliberately fomenting the war, the resistance against the IDF in Gaza. And all of that, and Egypt is playing a mediating role in the negotiation. So when you accuse your mediator of killing your soldiers in Gaza by allowing weapons to be smuggled, you're deliberately trying to sabotage this. And again, let's go back to what I mentioned before. This is Bibi's way of taking advantage of Biden being unable or unwilling to play a reasonable role here. And unfortunately, you have a situation where Bibi can basically do whatever he wants. And we've allowed that to happen. And unfortunately, the Israeli political system allows it to happen. And going also back to the resistance within Israel to Netanyahu, you have the families of the hostages who want their loved ones returned, and they want them returned either if they're dead, they want them returned for burial, or if they're alive, they want them to be free. And they are protesting against Netanyahu. They are demanding that there be a ceasefire so that this can happen. If there is a ceasefire, the war would eventually wind down, and Netanyahu is thumbing his nose at them. And just that's how hopeless the situation is politically inside Israel, I'm sorry to say.
Well, I mean, and while he's appeasing the right, Netanyahu is, what's happening to the left, or even centrists, or people who just say, I don't want him there? Are they being censored? Are they being harassed? What's happening? I mean, because they exist. And, I hear their stories. They're saying we're not being heard. It's not that we don't exist. We don't have the space to really talk. And then I read some data that says, okay, most Israeli citizens support this war on Gaza, not with Gaza, because they don't even have a standing army. I mean, can you explain that? I mean, and help to dispel some of the myths if that's what we're being fed.
Well, people outside of Israel like to think that there is an opposition. And there is technically an opposition in Israel in the Knesset. There's a former IDF commander, senior chief of staff, Benny Gantz, leads the opposition. But the opposition's position isn't that different from Netanyahu's position. And you can never get elected to anything in Israel by being in favor of peace or in favor of justice for Palestinians. There's no, the anti-Zionist camp in Israel is exceedingly small, unfortunately, and mostly composed of sort of oddballs, the term you used earlier, composed of people who are willing to buck the consensus in Israel and are willing to say things that no other Israeli takes seriously, which is what you were talking about with your father when he went to the Middle East in 1979. And I want to switch a little bit and go into what you were talking about earlier. I do think that the narrative has changed in the United States. No one was willing to use the word genocide until now. And until recently, no one was willing to use the word apartheid in Israel. And no one, it was a third rail of US politics to talk about withholding aid to Israel or ending aid to Israel. And now we have Bernie Sanders in the Senate calling for aid to be stopped to Israel. And we really have a sea change in the American discourse about the Middle East. We have, for the first time ever, polls of Democrats by the Gallup poll saying there's more sympathy among Democrats for Palestinians than Israel. This would have been unheard of. I'm sorry it's taken a genocide to make this happen, but it's really important that our discourse change about this issue. And there is a reaction against it. There is a strong, savage backlash that's funded by billionaires like Bill Ackman, the hedge fund manager, and others. And they have held the feet of the presidents and the Ivy League colleges to the fire, and they've gotten 3 of them to either be fired or resign. And now yesterday, my alma mater, Columbia University, has announced that 3 deans who criticized the Jewish student organization on campus that's called Hillel, they criticized Hillel during a panel at the university, and they've been basically fired as well. And including one of the deans was a senior vice president for the entire university. And they were technically they were suspended, but they're not going to return to their jobs as deans. And all that they were doing was saying that Hillel is using the threat of or the accusation of anti-Semitism against the college students, and they were saying that Hillel is using that to raise funds. It's clear that the Israel lobby uses the sort of chimera of anti-Semitism to raise funds. That's not something that should be controversial, but it does indicate how the backlash is so fierce because the Israel lobby sees its own position being threatened. And that's why the AIPAC is spending $100 million to defeat progressive candidates in Democratic primaries. And they've defeated Jamal Bowman in New York. They're trying to defeat Cori Bush in Missouri, and they're going to try to defeat Summer Lee in Pennsylvania. Luckily, they're not going after Ilhan Omar because I think that they realize that she is firmly ensconced in her position in representing Minnesota in Congress. But they've raised, and the funds, the $100 million that they've raised in the Democratic primaries is money from Republican billionaires. So we have Hakeem Jeffries, the leader of the Democratic caucus in Congress, basically embracing these billionaires because they're funding the Democratic Party, but the billionaires are trying to turn the Democratic Party into a pliant, non-resistant force in terms of opposing what Israel is doing in the American political arena. And it's shameful that the Democratic Party allows these $100 million to stream into the coffers of these sort of centrist Democrats who are going to be pro-Israel, who are going to support the Israel lobby, and encouraging them and enabling them to win primaries where they'll go on to win seats in Congress.
Oh, sorry. I just had a quick question. With that, I noticed that Netanyahu put out what I call his diss tape against Biden about 2 weeks ago, claiming that the Biden administration were slowing down weapon shipments to Israel and very much criticizing the president in a way that I don't think many allies would do so. That being said, we saw there was an interview with, I believe it was Ari Emanuel, where he talked about getting Biden out of the race. Do you think that the Israel lobby has something to do with the current attacks on Biden that seem to have just arisen and become the mantra in chat because of his actions to try to curtail the actions of Netanyahu, the UN resolution calling for a ceasefire, calling for them not to go for a ground offensive into Rafah, calling for a delay of the initial invasion? Do you think Netanyahu and part of that lobby is part of this drumbeat to get Biden out of the race, to have someone in there who won't offer any resistance at all to their actions?
Well, Netanyahu is a firm Republican, basically in his orientation. He hates Biden. He hated Obama. He hates anyone who isn't a Republican. He loves Trump, and he supported Trump. He put up a huge banner on a skyscraper in Tel Aviv with himself shaking Trump's hand during an election. But I would say that the Israel lobby is quite happy with Biden. He's a weak president. He allows the Israel lobby to do whatever it wants in terms of getting the $18 billion arms package passed through Congress and letting the JDAM bombs and all of the rockets and missiles that come from the U.S. arsenal, getting them into the hands of the IDF so they can be used against Gaza civilians. So the Israel lobby is happy with Biden, but they'd be even happier with Trump. So, and I think that Trump would be even worse than Biden. And that's saying something considering how bad Biden has been in this situation. So I think that what we have to do as Americans is we have to support the squad. We have to support every progressive member of the Democratic Party. We have to stand against these outrageous charges of anti-Semitism that are being leveled, by the way, against Jewish college students who are anti-Zionist, who are leaders in the movement and the campus anti-war protest movement that we saw in the last school year in major campuses around the United States and around the world. And we have to support these students. We have to support them whether they're Jewish or Muslim or Christian, whatever variety they are. And we have to say clearly, this is not anti-Semitism that they're doing. There is nothing anti-Semitic in saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. There's nothing at all that's anti-Semitic about that. And we also have to say that this is an abuse of the term anti-Semitism. It's a manufactured anti-Semitism. It's not real anti-Semitism, and they're using it in order to support Israel. And that's not the intent of the term anti-Semitism. It's meant to stop hatred against Jews. It's not meant to stop criticism of Israel. And anyone, such as the Israel Lobby, such as the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee and all these other groups, AIPAC, have to stop, and we need to tell them that they have to stop this abuse of the term anti-Semitism. It only makes Jews more insecure in this country. It only encourages white supremacists to attack the Jews and attack, of course, the Muslim Americans and other groups in this country, Black Americans as well. And we have to really stand in the path of these kinds of charges and the agenda of the Israel lobby. That's our duty, I think, as Americans, to do that.
Well, it's also concerning Robert, just give me 1 hot second, because I want you to jump in. Don't forget that. Maybe you need to write it down, because we get a little older, we forget. But I didn't want to forget this fact, because I'm older than you. One of the things that concerns me particularly is I watched what happened to Jamal Bowman in New York. And I don't know if you've come across this on your radio show, Robert Patillo, but I have in my various media spaces. The Jewish community, well, the Zionist community, the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they have been attacking the Black progressives, with a ferocity. I mean, I saw them do it with Reverend Jackson, with a ferocity, and they leave Mike Huckabee, who makes some sly remarks that are anti-Jewish, and they got to leave white people alone, but they go after these folks. And I'm wondering, because the race in New York with Jamal Bowman was so vicious, and there's so many hurt feelings, and there's a lot of anger there still. I'm hoping that this will not be a cleave in an alliance that we absolutely need, with Black people and Jewish people, and quite frankly, with oppressed people. Could you see that happening, Richard Silverstein?
I think that that's really helps the Israel lobby when they can divide the African Americans from Jews, and they divide a progressive coalition, and they attempt to stop the strength of people like Bernie Sanders, and stop the strength of progressive Black candidates. By the way, in Maryland, the last primary, Donna Edwards ran. I can't remember if it was for a House seat or a Senate seat, and they poured $6 million into the race to defeat her.
Well,
and
that's
the way
how
they
she
do
lost
it,
her House seat, right?
she lost. Well, she didn't have a seat because she had vacated it to run for governor, I think. But she lost the race to regain her former seat, which she had dropped out of. So, and that was only $6 million. Now they spent $21 million against Jamal Bowman. $21 million for a single House seat in a primary. So they have upped the ante.
$20 million. Yeah, they offered
They spent
$20 million in
they
Michigan.
spent $20 million, and the way that they spent it was also deceptive, because they didn't contribute directly to George Latimer, who was the white opponent who won that seat. They create these sort of like AstroTurf organizations. They did this by the way, in Oregon, where my representative, Pramila Jayapal, her sister was running for a seat in Portland, and they took a climate change organization and plowed $5 million into the organization, which they'd never had anything like that in their budget. And they spent all that money to defeat Sunil Jayapal as a progressive candidate in that primary. So this is the way they're operating. They're operating sort of through subterfuge, through deception, and it's just going to create an enormous amount of hostility in the American people against Jews, because we are going to be blamed, even though many of us are anti-Zionists. We are the ones who are going to be blamed. The anti-Semites, the white supremacists, don't make a distinction between progressive Jews and Zionist Jews. They see all of us as just Jews and as the enemy, and so this is the negative impact that this subterfuge and deception is having on the American political process.
Do they understand that?
Does the Israel lobby understand that?
Yeah,
I don't think that they care. Their priority is Israel. They don't care what happens to Jews in France or in the United States. They see us as a prop for their agenda, which is to support Israel to the greatest extent possible. And if harm comes to Jews in the United States or in France or wherever, because of this anti-Semitism, they see us as expendable. Certainly Israel sees us as expendable, because they don't believe that the diaspora outside of Israel has really any meaning except to support them. And they don't have the interests of Jewish communities in the diaspora as part of their priorities. Their priorities are Israel. Their priorities are do whatever it takes to support Israel. And if Jews stand in the way, if Jews pose an obstacle, then the first thing they'll try to do is smear us, like Greenblatt, who you mentioned earlier. By the way, Jonathan Greenblatt called the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is one of the groups that has been the most vocal opposing the war, called Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine as campus proxies for Hezbollah. And Republicans in Congress have called for Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine to be investigated by the FBI for their so-called financial support being given to them by terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, which is, I mean, I don't have the words to describe how stupid and outrageous that is. But that's where we are in American politics to a certain extent, where they're trying to turn the anti-war movement into sort of, McCarthyite tactics and calling us the equivalent of communists and Marxists and whatever terms they want to use. And that's how strong and powerful that message is from the Israel lobby.
Robert Patillo, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
You did not interrupt me at all. I did have this question that after the Israeli assassination of the Iranian officials, we saw the 300 missile and drone strike against Israel that was thwarted by a coalition of U.S., British, and Middle Eastern forces. And then shortly thereafter, the president of Iran just mysteriously was in a helicopter crash where they hit a mountain. We're just going to assume that all that is just weather related. But do you think with the recent Iranian elections that are currently going towards a runoff, if they do go from a reformer such as Raisi to a more hardline president, do you think that will encourage some of the regional foes to unite and see if they can overwhelm the Iron Dome system for additional strikes against Israel? Basically, do you think the Israeli policy currently is making things worse in the region versus towards moving towards a peaceful solution?
Well, a good question, as all of your questions have been. I think that Israel thrives on instability in the region. It thrives on dividing its enemies, if possible. It's tried to do that between the PLO and Hamas. That's why they helped create Hamas. It's why they helped create Hezbollah, which is ironic because then Hamas has turned around to be one of the Palestinian most powerful form of resistance against Israel, and same with Hezbollah. They create their own enemies by doing this, but it serves this attempt to divide its enemies and weaken them. And I think that the war in Lebanon, which I'm going to not say the potential war because I think there will be one, will rally Iran in order to protect Hezbollah because it's one of its chief allies among the frontline states that surround Israel. So Iran says that it will join in a war against Israel if Israel invades Lebanon. So Iran has allies, Shia allies and militia in Iraq, and the Syrians, which the Iranians are supporting Bashar Assad in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, who the Iranians are supporting. They're all going to participate in protecting, defending Lebanon from Israeli aggression. So you have the possibility of one of the first regional wars in the Middle East since 1967. And Israel will be totally responsible if that happens. And I want to add that my reporting, my sources in Israel say that Israel was responsible or was involved in the downing of the helicopter that the president of Iran was flying in, it basically did that because it wants to make the Iranian leadership pay a price for being its enemy. There is one hopeful thing happening in the presidential election to replace the president Raisi, who was killed or assassinated. That is that a relatively moderate candidate appears to have won that election. So while the role of president in Iran is quite attenuated in terms of what powers he has, you won't have as much bellicosity out of Iran. You will have possibly more interest in negotiating to renew the Iran nuclear deal with a president like the one who has won. You might have a little bit less inclination towards sort of lighting a fire in the region. But I do think even with a progressive or reformist president, Iran will have to respond if Israel attacks Lebanon. No matter who is in power in Iran, that's a red line that cannot be crossed. They will not accept crossing that. So I'm afraid to say that we have a lot of danger in store in the region, and Gaza is not the end of this tragedy that we're seeing. It could go on and it could expand, and God, I hope it doesn't. But it pays to be a pessimist when it comes to things like that.
Well, because my question then is, because if you're hearing this chitter chatter from your sources in Israel about the downing of the helicopter, the assassination of the president, of course, that's all of the streets in Tehran. And while you might have the leadership at the top who are willing to make certain compromises, I'm wondering if they will have to deal with pressure from the people, from the bottom up. That could completely change the calculus of all of this. I mean, and make this global conflict, just given all of the resources that the West we need that are in that region. I mean, because we've always wanted an outpost there, right? I mean, that's why we kicked out, Mossadegh, 60, 70 years ago. And we just keep on going with this. But the zeitgeist is not with us, Richard Silverstein. I mean, those who were colonized all around the world are rising up. And I'm just wondering if the Netanyahus and the Bidens and the Western world, I don't know if they really get it, because things are shifting. I mean, American public opinion has shifted, and along with that shift, because everybody who is fighting for Palestinian justice, you're not anti-Jewish. But what's coming with that, what frightens me, and it frightens me because I'm someone, as a Black person who's lived under the boot, and Attorney Patel, you can understand that, and you understand it, Richard Silverstein, is what accompanies that. The anti-Jewish hatred, specifically the anti-Jewish hatred, because, you and the Arabs are cousins, it's Semitic people, I get it. But that's when you read the comments that accompany the stories. That to me is unsettling. And I'm wondering if the Jonathan Greenblatts and these people, if they get it. I'm like, do you not know what's coming behind this? And it's unsettling. I mean, in a time when you have And you have nationalists on the left and the right, but you have white supremacists who are pushing because they feel like they're losing. Do they not understand? And Robert, feel free to jump in because I'm because I know what I'm hearing, and I know I have to stop some people when they call in and say, "Well, wait a minute, don't go down that street because that's not true." Ah,
Well,
Robert.
well, well, on that point, I have callers who call into my show who are afraid to even say the word Jewish.
Yeah.
They're afraid that they will be called an anti-Semite. They're afraid that they criticize Israel, or if they're seen as making anti-Israel statements, that they will lose their jobs, that they could be punished in various ways. And I just don't think that's a healthy conversation that we can have. One of my callers this Sunday made the point that you can have a song on the radio that says N-word every other word, but if you just say the word Jewish out loud, you'll turn into Kanye. And do you think this is a healthy political discourse where people are literally afraid to even criticize? Or this discussion right now we couldn't have had 5 years ago that we're having, so there's progress. But do you think more progress has to be made in having a more even-handed discussion around criticism of our policy vis-a-vis Israel and the Middle East? Because I agree with you. I think that Israel is trying to foment, or Netanyahu is trying to foment a strike by Iran so they can justify striking Iran's nuclear facilities as a form of retaliation. They're the only nation in the Middle East that has stealth fighters. They can do it very easily. They just need to cast this belli to do so.
If I could jump in, I think that um, that that the Israel lobby, Jonathan Greenblatt doesn't care about what's good for America. He cares about what's good for Israel. He cares about basically his white, I call them, even though they're Jewish, I call them the white male billionaire donors. They're the ones who set the agenda for the Anti-Defamation League. And Jonathan Greenblatt is their representative, their spokesperson that they hire to front their agenda. And going back to what you were talking about, the distinction between Jews and Israel, I think it's really important for your listeners to understand that the issue is Israel. The issue is Zionism. That American Jews are not a monolith. We're not all Zionists. We're not all pro-Israel. And that we're willing to criticize Israel. We're willing to call Israel a genocidal state, even though as a Jew, it hurts me to have to say that because, Israel is a central kind of issue and place for most or all Jews. And so for many of us, it's been a tragedy in our relationship to Israel to have to acknowledge how terrible this country has become. But I think it's really important not to use the word Jew or Jewish when you're talking about Israel, and not to use terms like the Jewish lobby. You have to use the term Israel lobby. It's true that most or many Jews support the Israel lobby, but and the same thing with the Black community. You have Black progressives and you have Black conservatives like
Clarence
a
Thomas.
Republican in South Carolina who's in the Senate. There's no monolith among all of us. There's distinctions, and the progressives in the Jewish community, progressives in the Black community, progressives in the Muslim community have to come together and get rid of these kinds of monolithic attitudes that people have towards what we are and towards the composition of our communities. It's our values rather than our race or our religion that have to really make the distinctions clear. And I can't emphasize how important it is to me as a Jew that people understand that what Israel is doing, it may claim that it's doing it on behalf of the Jewish people, but that only increases anti-Semitism. And that's another reason why Jews have to come forward and say, not in my name. That's one of the anti-war groups that you mentioned earlier that's doing important work. And it's really important for us to come forward and say, What Israel is doing is a violation of Jewish values. It's a violation of Jewish tradition. There's nothing in my view of my religion that says that Israel should become a genocidal state. Genocide is not in well, there is genocide in the Bible. In terms of, well, we can go into
everything's in
discussion.
the Bible.
Yeah.
Every malady known to humankind is in the Bible.
Right. But it's not in my tradition to apartheid is not a Jewish value, and genocide is not a Jewish value, and that's important for us as Jews to say, and to also renounce the Israel lobby and say they do not represent us, and we cannot allow them to represent us. And I think among American Jews, especially the younger generation, they are willing to go into this arena with that kind of a view of things. And I mentioned my oldest son, who is a representative of that younger generation. The younger generation is the hope. I think that they will change the discourse, something I was addressing earlier, so that we can talk about these things that were formerly taboo. They're not saddled with all of the old attitudes and the old sort of taboos that sort of imprisoned us when we are doing what we're doing. And the change in the discourse in America may, and I hope will, make the United States able to become more objective about Israel and more assertive. If Joe Biden had telephoned Netanyahu and say, tomorrow I'm stopping all military aid to Israel until you stop the war. If he had done that simple thing and followed through in Congress and told the Democrats in Congress there will be no more appropriation bills for weapons in Israel, the war would stop within a week or sooner. But he's not willing to do that, and that's the tragedy that we have to face as Americans.
Well, I mean, there's been so much conflating down through the years. I think it can take a hot second. Well, take a minute to kind of separate this out, to make it the Israeli lobby. Because, of course, John F. Kennedy was trying to make, AIPAC register as foreign agents. And, of course, there was this hue and cry, don't do that to us. From there, not from here, not from the United States, because many American Jews said, yeah, you should register as foreign agents because I'm not signing on to all of this. And I think it's important to tell that history, Richard Silverstein and attorney Robert Patillo, because when we tell that history, number one, we're being fair, because then you can see that there's been no monolithic thought. What is a Congressman Bill Clay former Congressman Bill Clay from Missouri said, we don't have permanent friends, we don't have permanent enemies, we have permanent interests. And that's just a rule of politics. And I'm just wondering, well, I believe that we can get there, because that's why I'm hopeful. That's why I hold Richard Silverstein, I keep hope alive, because I really think that we're beginning to get there, because as Robert, you pointed out, 5 years ago, we couldn't have had this conversation. And I remember during the 88 campaign, because it was just so much, we knew who was going to come after us. The 84 campaign, we knew who was going to come after us, because we knew my Harvard interview, you might have heard about that. I was read the Riot Act, by a Jewish lawyer. And they wanted to know if I was going to be independent of my father and his politics. And they let me know. He said, as I walked into the room, I don't like your father or your politics. Let's see about you. And there we went. And I'm 17. I can't do anything but absorb the insult and the assault for 45 minutes to an hour. I'll never forget it. But that having been said, I also know the games that are played. Because even after the whole hue and cry in the 84 campaign, my father and I were riding down the elevator, Richard Silverstein and attorney Robert Patillo, and you'll be happy to know, Robert, I am writing now, because I'm writing about these experiences, because you said you need to tell people what
exactly.
We're coming down the elevator, and this is Rabbi Meir Kahana is going to march on our home and threatening to kill all of us, my brothers, my sister, my mom, my dad, and I, and all of that. And, you know, Town, which Milton Coleman had never heard Reverend say, and all of that. We're coming down the elevator, and there was I've shared this story with Robert before. There was the person who flanked the candidate carried an Uzi, which at the time was the most powerful submachine gun in the world, and it was Israeli made. It could have been made anywhere. It was made there. Not a big deal. That's, to me, of no consequence. But the person who carried the Uzi had a certain disposition, and they were almost disconnected from the rest of the Secret Service team. And my father's Secret Service team was second in size only to that of the president's. That's how threatened he was. So, and I was always watching the person with the Uzi, because they let you know that once they activate it, they can't stop it. And it fires off hundreds of rounds, and it is designed to kill everybody in the perimeter, at least seriously injure them. So if something happens, you know, my father was, well, I'm going to jump on top of you. I'm like, well, I'm going to jump on top of you. We don't have to fight. I'm not going to let anything happen to my daddy. Are you kidding? As we're coming down the elevator shaft in Los Angeles, he said, guess what his name is? The gentleman with the Uzi. And I said, I don't know. Daddy, I have no idea. Jaime. He was an Israeli American. I said, wow, these are the games that people play. While what he's trying to do, and he's not a perfect person, but as my mother said, who's been with him 63 years, she said, my husband doesn't have a mean bone in his body. And he doesn't. He forgives everybody. You know that, Robert. People do awful things to him. And you're wondering, Reverend, why are they here? He's like, you know, we're going to give them a chance, and we're going to let them go forward. I see the damage that the Israeli lobby are doing to American Jews and to everybody. I mean, they're hurting the country. And by hurting the country, they're hurting American Jews because they're getting blamed. And it's like, but we're all being hurt. Whenever you hurt anybody anywhere, it hurts everybody everywhere. I mean, bottom line, I mean, it's Gaza today, it's Haiti right now, it's Yemen, it's everywhere. I mean, can we have peace somewhere? I mean, Richard Silverstein, where do we go from here? I mean, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, Robert Patillo, and then you the last couple of minutes, Richard Silverstein, because I want to know how we get off the dime here, because we have an opportunity with a new election, but we do have a weakened president who, as I'm listening to you, Richard Silverstein, has helped me to look at this in another way. Netanyahu must be happy to have Biden here because he's addled. You know, that's why I'm like, stop talking about his age. We've been wondering if he's ill. And now we're seeing that he's ill. They can continue to play this game if they want to, but by having an ill president, you've got the NATO leaders, Robert, who are trying to figure out, what am I walking into in Washington? Well, you've got, I mean, it's just, it destabilizes us. Robert?
Well, I think what we have to look at is very much what we're seeing on the international stage, for example. We saw the UK elections this week, where you saw an alliance between the Labour Party, the Greens, the Lib Dems, and they were able to utterly destroy the Tories and even the Reform UK Party. Nigel Farage's answer to the MAGA movement there. Look at what happened in France. You had Emmanuel Macron's centrist party, and then also the leftist movement coming together to defeat Marie Le Pen and the far right-wing fascist version of the party. Mexican elections, we saw the centrist party and the left-wing party come together to elect a liberal Jewish Mexican woman to be the next president of Mexico. So what we're seeing on an international stage is that we can have a coalition between the left-leaning party as well as the centrist party to push back against the fascist party. Those things are effective, and we're seeing this in election after election, except for where you have autocratic dictators like the election of Modi in
India.
In India, as well as Erdogan's re-election in Turkey. I think what has to happen is we need to have a come to Jesus meeting in the center and the left of American politics, and simply say we have a very clear and direct choice in this next election. Either we can come together as these other countries have and stop a fascist takeover of our nation, or we can be in line with Erdogan, Modi, Lukashenko, Orban, Erdogan, and be on that side of the aisle on international politics. Europe is already de-Americanizing when it comes to their defense. They no longer see America as their stable guarantor. We're seeing them come together. Poland has a plan to have the largest land army in Europe by 2030. We're seeing billions of dollars being pumped into defense because they don't believe that America will be there to stand up for them. Well, similarly, in the Middle East, we're seeing Middle Eastern nations rearm at rapid rates. We're seeing them put in conscription policies in order to bring in more people into their militaries, because they theorize that America will not be there to be the kind of global policeman, global stabilizing force to ensure domestic tranquility. So in America, we are going to have to have a serious conversation about how do we come together around a single candidate, and who will that single candidate be. My position is it will be physically impossible to remove Joe Biden at this point in time, but what we can influence is the Democratic Party platform and what they're campaigning on going into this fall and what they're demanding. When you have a president who is weak, as Biden has been described as being, that means that we have an opportunity to make real demands on the Democratic Party platform and what it will take to get across the finish line. And I think that we have to ensure that we have an even-handed approach where the Israeli lobby and Netanyahu is not picking our Congress people, is not picking our presidents, and is not simply walking to Washington, D.C. and writing his own policy and then walking out the back door with billions of dollars. I think if we come together around that, we can push towards that two-state solution and also extricate America from this possibility of being the next fascist superpower. Netanyahu is very much closer to Putin than he is to the Democratic North that we believe in. He's been the dictator of Israel since I've been in high school, and it doesn't look like that's changing anytime soon. So we have to change our policies here in the States to match the realities that exist on the ground.
Richard Silverstein, the last 2 minutes belong to you.
Thanks. I want to add something important in terms of the Biden status in the race. Yesterday, my senator here in Washington State, Patty Murray, is very powerful member of the Democratic, I don't know if you call it a majority, a 50-50 split, but she's a very, very powerful and important figure in the Senate. And she came out with a very strong statement saying that Biden has to go. I think she's the first Democratic senator who's actually made any statement along those lines. And if Patty Murray is taking that position, I think that his status is increasingly weak. And just in terms of, domestic politics, I wanted to make that comment in terms of whether Biden will be the candidate to come November. But I wanted to go back to what you said earlier, Santita, about U.S. interests vis-a-vis Israel. I think that the Israel lobby is saying that there are permanent allies, that Israel is that the U.S. is a permanent ally of Israel, that there can never be any daylight between Israel and the U.S. In terms of what Israel's interests are. And that is a toxic formula, because it means that the U.S. can never have its own separate interests from Israel. That we always have to be doing what we're doing now in Gaza, which is to fund genocide. And we cannot acknowledge what Bernie Sanders is saying, which is that, yes, our interests diverge. We as American people are not going to support genocide, even if we have a strong sense of connection and bond between Israel, the Israeli people, and the American people. You can go this far, but you can't go beyond. You can go up to this point in terms of there being interests in common, but we will not go farther towards apartheid, towards what's happening in the West Bank with the occupation. We will not follow you into Gaza. And that's where U.S. policy needs to be in Israel. And again, I'm going to go talk about the younger generation. I think that there is hope that this younger generation can make that distinction and say, we are not going to be anti-Semitic if we say, as an American people, that we have our own interests, and as long as they coincide, we will be there for Israel. And when they don't, we will be able to have an independent position, and we won't be smeared, and we won't be called anti-Semites, because America needs to be able to pursue its own interests and its own values and its own traditions in our foreign policy. And we are not, unfortunately, doing that right now. Hopefully, at some point in the future, we will be.
Well, getting back to where the founding fathers wanted us to be, that is what George Washington said. He didn't get everything right, but he got that part right. But Americans have had to evolve into being Americans. Let us not forget, a dedicated Anglophile was Benjamin Franklin. He had to grow into his Americanness, as did our founding fathers and mothers. They were British, but somewhere along the way they changed. And I think that we're at yet another inflection point where we can truly make America great. We can get there. We have all the stuff we need to get there. We can do that. And, I'm going to work and work and work like you, Richard Silverstein, and you, Attorney Robert Patillo, and the people younger than you. We're going to make it happen. We're going to make it happen. Sending so much love to you both. And thank you so much for being with us today, Richard Silverstein. I hope this will not be your last time. Hope you'll consider the Santita Jackson Show your home.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Wonderful invitation. I'll take you up on it.
May God bless you early in the morning.
Very early, yes. Sun is rising.
I know. AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. Sending you all so much love. Have